we see two massive waves of barbarian invasion of the Roman Empire, which is not a kind of, let's go and invade Rome because it's fun kind of phenomenon.
Adventurous expeditions.
It is. There's no sign they would ever have done any of that if the Huns hadn't turned up. And an awful lot of those who try invading the Roman Empire get destroyed by Roman counteraction. This is not an easy thing to do. It's not a pleasant choice. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, but quite large numbers do, and enough that the Roman Empire can't defeat them all individually. So we get too big a rush.
Peter Heather is Chair of Medieval History at King's College, London. His many books include The Fall of the Roman Empire, Rome Resurgent, Christendom, and most recently, Why Empires Fall, Rome, America, and the Future of the West, which he co-authored with John Rapley, and which is what we're going to be discussing today. Professor Heather, welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to take part in the conversation.
What a pleasure. All right. When thinking about the fall of Rome, which is pretty popular amongst men these days, so I'm told, even memes are being made about this topic, mocking us. I have to say that I'm guilty as charged as well, hence why I invited you in the first place. But when we're thinking about the fall of Rome, I think most of us instantly visualize that famous painting by Thomas Cole. I believe it's called Destruction, or
yes, it is.
Destruction of the Empire. Yeah. And on it, we see hordes of stinky barbarians pouring into this beautiful city, desecrating its glorious white marble structures, dragging women away and burning everything they can get their hands on. In short, the painting is sort of kind of hinting that Rome became too complacent, if it is Rome in the painting. I think that's the usual interpretation. But anyway, that Rome became too complacent and kind of too weak, which is why it was finally brought to its knees by these vast barbarian hordes who were constantly banging on its doors. What, if anything, is wrong with this interpretation of the fall of Rome? You can say everything.
Yeah, where do you want to begin? Well, I think
okay. Fair enough.
I mean, it's picking up a trope that's there in kind of historical literature, starting even before Edward Gibbon and going beyond. And it is this. I think what's fundamentally wrong about it, and what I find frustrating about it, is the sort of, as we would almost say now, colonial concentration on the imperial structure itself, as though it always has its own future in its own hands, and that it should, in inverted commas, have been able to go on forever had it had the willpower or the moral force or the whatever qualities you think are appropriate for sustaining an empire, had it continued to exercise the same kind of moral power and will and determination that had shown in the period of its creation, then it should have been able to endure forever. And certainly for myself and for my co-author, who's a modern political economist, John Rapley, it's worth saying, which is why we have the dual focus in the book, this is what is deeply unsatisfactory about those kind of traditional images, in the sense that when you're looking for, what changes as the imperial structure unravels, there's plenty of change inside the Roman world. There always was. Nothing is ever unchanging. Imperial systems, societies, cultures evolve. You would expect that. But if you're looking at the kind of raw strategic power, if you're thinking in terms of economic strength, military strength, demographic strength, people as well, then the big shifts are not happening inside the empire itself. The empire has many limitations. This is a thing that ran from Hadrian's Wall to Iraq in a world where people move at about 40 kilometers a day. So, it's unconscionably vast. It's like running the whole of Eurasia now, or something bigger. This is never going to be a perfect structure. Well, even small perfect human structures don't exist, let alone big ones. So there's always going to be problems within it. You can find problems, but they are not showing any signs whatsoever of pulling the imperial system apart by itself. What really changes is the world around it. And this is the narrative that's always interested me. The changing of the strategic context, if you like, in which the Roman Empire operates, and more particularly, and this is the sort of central argument of the book that John and I both share. I'd thought about Rome and also thought about the modern world even before talking to John, and John knows far more about the modern world than I do, but he kind of reinforced the lines of thought that were pinging through my brain. It is actually that these imperial systems not only come apart because the world has changed around them, but they materially make the world around them change. So in other words, there's a kind of Newton's third law of empire. To every empire, there's an opposite and equal reaction over time. I mean, it doesn't happen quickly, but it happens. That imperial systems and the way that they interact with surrounding populations change that strategic context in which they're operating and make it increasingly difficult for themselves to continue to operate as they had operated in the past. So that's this is
if we're being right, if we're being a bit more specific, how did Rome change its surroundings?
Yeah, it changes it in just about every way. When you look at the evidence is obviously, as you would expect, a bit rubbish. You don't get detailed accounts of everything that you would like to get. On the other hand, the archaeological picture is now increasingly rich, and it reinforces what you find if you go looking for it in the texts. Namely, that there is an agricultural revolution operates on its borders. I'm talking here particularly about its European neighbours. Between the birth of Christ and about 400, you get more productive agricultural economies growing up. The reason why Rome is implicated in that is that Rome sticks this huge military force on its frontiers with a vast demand for foodstuffs, for raw materials, for labour, for leather goods, for timber, you name it. And actually, it's very reasonable to think that the agricultural systems around Rome adapt in order to be able to satisfy Roman demand and make money out of it. There are plenty of transactions that record this. But an incidental effect of increasing your intensity of your agricultural regimes is that there's more food available in your own society and populations increase. Before the 19th century, then the big there are two big limiting factors on the size of potential populations. One is disease, which acts periodically, but the other structural one that's always there is the amount of food that your agricultural regime can produce. And whenever we see advances in agricultural technique in the sort of pre-modern world, we see populations increase. So Rome plays a role there. It also plays a role in developing social and political complexity, because it is a rich target. The one thing that's not wrong about that painting is that those outside Rome like to raid it. In fact, what's perhaps the only thing that's wrong about it is it shows them pulling over statues and things like that. But actually, such was the difference in the economies that they were interested in much more prosaic things as well. There was a fascinating find dredged up out of the Rhine near the German city of Speyer in the 1960s and early 70s. There was 2 cartloads of stuff, which was clearly the entire looted contents of a Roman villa, were trying to be carted back across the Rhine. And they were intercepted or they sank or whatever. So you see what they took. And they took absolutely everything. They take all the frying pans. They take all the ladles. I think there are 8 different sizes of frying pan in this collection because the metal was valuable. It was an easy source of metal. Yep,
I don't know why I'm laughing, but the image in
I
my
know.
head is
Is
just
that
very funny
you
of
think
these
barbarians are out there after gold and
exactly hairy
jewels and whatever?
barbarians with a cart
Yeah,
full of pans,
taking frying pans. Yeah, no, exactly.
right?
To me, it's well, it's an extraordinarily vivid image of what might be of interest. So Rome is very interested, therefore, in forming relationships with groups beyond the frontier who will minimize raiding and difficulties and this kind of stuff. So they're always looking for allies and sponsoring them with diplomatic subsidies and trading privileges, which those actors beyond the frontier can then use to reinforce their role in their own societies. 300 years of that, which is what we see, and you start to see the build-up of much larger and more powerful political actors in the non-Roman world. And we get, so, when Rome first moves into Central Europe in the century either side of the birth of Christ, so 50 BC to 50 AD, this is a world of very small political communities. Tacitus lists about 60 of them just on the territory of Western Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czech and Slovak republics, and Germany. So if you think of just that area, then divided between 60, these things are tiny. But by the time we get to the 4th century, after 300 years of this kind of diplomatic interaction and manipulation, we find much bigger confederations on the frontier. Again, they're not ungiven to fragmentation, shall we say, but the 50 or 60 have disappeared, and they've been subsumed into confederations that might contain something like 10 or a dozen of the previous smaller entities. And that's just the start of the process. So this is what I mean about changing the strategic context, if you like. You affect the economy in fundamental ways. Social and political power is always closely related to economic structures. So if you change the economic structures, you're changing social and political patterns as well. And the overall effect of all of these things working together is to place the later Roman Empire in the context of a smaller number of more powerful neighbours. And it not just doing this on its European frontiers, it's also doing it on all its other frontiers as well.
I think part of the problem that we have, or I have, is picturing barbarians as a sort of constant. You know that scene? Have you seen The Gladiator? I'm sorry, I'm bringing The Gladiator up,
Great
but
film.
I can't help myself.
Great film.
You know that first scene with the German barbarians, and they're these unwashed people with long hair, just a small band. They have no chance against the might of the Roman army. And they come with like verflickte Hunde or whatever they say, and they have the head of the Roman messenger, and they're throwing it around. And I think when we picture barbarians, it's always that kind of an image. They never evolve. They stay that way in our imagination, right? But just for slight pushback from a complete non-historian here, but preparing for this interview, I quickly skimmed through the list of emperors in the last 100 years or so of the Western Roman Empire. Wikipedia guilty as charged here.
Sure.
And it seems that almost yeah, I agree. But it seems that almost all of them got murdered after a year or two, sometimes after a couple of months even. Looking at this list, it seemed more like some sort of a constant mafia shootout instead of a state with stable institutions. This aspect alone seems a little bit problematic internally, and we kind of can't blame barbarians for it, can we?
Well, that's an interesting question. In part, we can.
Oh, wow. I was not expecting that answer, but please go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as I said at the beginning, you can't, there's no perfect political society, and succession is always a difficult problem. Even in the Roman Empire's most stable periods, succession is always the thing that brings out the knives, because there's so much at stake. You get your man on the throne and everything follows. So this is why people who are in high political circles are always interested in succession, and they're always looking to it. But 2 points about what we see. You're talking about the 5th century there, where we get this very swift. Well, you get alternate periods of quite long reigns, and then intense periods of infighting, and then another period of a relative. I mean, it's more that.
A couple of guys
Yeah,
there,
it's more
are
that
keeping the
pattern
peace for a
than
bit
sort of
longer.
everybody dying every year, as it were.
Okay.
It is really that succession becomes very messy. And I think the reason why barbarians are involved in this is by the time we get to this highly messy succession process, we've already got some very large, two major barbarian settlements on Roman soil. And that is complicating the political game and putting extra pressure on it. So there's much more at stake. And that's one reason why succession becomes so bloody, is because it's really important. And the barbarian groups are already settled on Roman soil. We've got 2 large settlements. You've got Vandals, Alans in Spain and then North Africa, and you've got Goths in southwestern Gaul, France, as is. They become further power blocks in the struggle for power. They're putting their oar in. They are looking to destabilize in their own interests. At this point, they don't think that the empire is going to end. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. The settlements have happened by the end of the first 2 decades of the 5th century. The western half of the empire carries on for another 50 years after that. And for about 40 of those years, no one thinks the empire is ever going to end. What we're trying to do is maximize our position within the imperial system, not bring the thing down. It's only later on they realize, oh my God, it's going to end. The new game in town is to establish your own kingdom, independent kingdom, which should be as big as possible, not maximize your position within this structure. This structure is over, but that takes a long time for people to do that. So I think barbarians are firmly implicated in that process.
Interesting. All right. I know you get asked this all the time, but it's such a popular talking point that it needs clearing up over and over again, probably. In the collective imagination, there's this persistent idea that, okay, yes, there might have been an oddball or even a psycho sitting on the throne here and there, like Caligula or Nero or Commodus, but that it was more of an anomaly in Rome's earlier period. Later on, however, total decadence takes over, causing the empire to rot from within. Is there any truth to that at all?
I honestly don't think there is. And this is the sort of new, my main reason for thinking that is that the new body of evidence that became available in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, when archaeologists developed the capacity for testing the overall health, as it were, of Rome's economy for the first time. Because Rome's economy, towns are important, whatever, but it's an agricultural economy. And towns are there for the most part to make the agricultural economy work better. So what you really need to know about to understand the health of the Roman Empire is what's going on in the countryside. How many people are there? How busy is it? What's the intensity of rural production like? And before about 1970, there was no capacity for looking at that. All you could do is look at the towns and see whether public buildings are being maintained or not. There was no systematic way to look at how many people might be occupying the Roman countryside. What changed that was the new technique of field surveying, which in turn relied on being able to identify and date Roman pottery and to know what density of pottery on the surface of a field represents a settlement underneath or is likely to. And it's the build-up of the knowledge to get to that point that takes until 1970 or thereabouts. Certainly by the mid-70s, you can date Roman pottery to within 10 years. And you also know from trials And these have been confirmed now, where you can now use ground radar, of course, which wasn't available in the 1970s, but they've confirmed the general pattern that if you get a dense enough cluster of Roman pottery sherds on the surface, because modern ploughing goes down deep enough with tractors actually to pull up the hidden layers, then you can tell that there's a settlement underneath. And because you can date the pottery, you can therefore date the settlement, and you know how many settlements there are. So the later 1970s and 1980s are full of teams of archaeologists walking up and down valleys of the Roman world, picking up every last single damn piece of pottery and putting it in plastic bags. They literally operated with 1 meter square
Well,
pieces of wood.
not exactly Indiana
No,
Jones, is it?
absolutely not. I would never. They did go swimming in the afternoon if they were doing it in the Mediterranean. That was the good part. But this is not wildly exciting activity, but the results were exciting.
Okay.
Because the collective results that emerged is that over the vast majority of Roman landscapes, not quite all, but the vast majority, so southern Britain, most of France, most of Spain, certainly North Africa, did quite a lot on territory of what's now Israel, Greece, Turkey, that actually the period of maximum occupation, so maximum rural population and maximum rural activity, is actually the late Empire. It's the 4th century. In Gibbon's view, and it's the kind of view you've got actually in Gladiator as well, the 2nd century is the apogee of the empire.
The peak.
Yeah.
Right.
And everything is
Marcus Aurelius.
Absolutely. Marcus damn Aurelius. He's the man. That's where it's all so fabulous.
Smart guy.
Yeah. Had enough time to meditate and do philosophy.
Right.
Because, the empire was just so great. It didn't need him from 9 to 5 in the way that it would do later. But, it's become clear that's not correct. The 2nd century was absolutely fine, but the 4th century was much richer. There's no doubt that, as it were, maximum gross imperial product would be in the 4th century. And it's not just a single area. These surveys, bless them, were done not quite everywhere because you couldn't get everywhere, but most places in the Roman world that were tested, that was the picture you got. So the idea that the empire is going downhill by the 4th century, and this is, that's the standard picture you'll find in anything written before about 1916, is that the empire is going downhill from the 2nd century onwards, very much downhill by the 4th century, and the 5th century collapse is just a natural product of this 4th century malaise, which is already so deeply established. But that's, this is what would have all my sort of earlier peers rotating in their graves. I hope with excitement, that they would just enjoy it. My God, we know something we didn't know before, this huge body of data, and it is a huge body of data. You can imagine all the little plastic bags we're talking about here. This is not a small
an IKEA warehouse.
Yeah, absolutely. They'd probably sell you some nice containers to keep the pottery in as well. It would be very, very, very helpful. But yes.
But Professor, if I may ask, since the empire wasn't expanding, at least not that much in the 4th century, how come it was so rich? I thought all the riches were coming when Rome was expanding.
Well,
earlier.
It depends what you mean by
all the slaves and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you get lots of movable wealth early on. These triumphal parades that you're getting in 1st century BC and 1st century AD Rome, or particularly the 1st century BC. By the 1st century AD, they're just conquering Britain, and you don't get very much from Britain. But in the 1st century BC, you're conquering Egypt and things like that. So you're parading the ancient wealth of the Near East through the streets of Rome. That kind of movable wealth we're not seeing so much of by the 4th century, but the fundamental generator of wealth is agricultural production in the Roman Empire, and that's at its peak. So we have and in fact they turn up in the historical written evidence. We have a very well established and very prosperous landowning elite who's lives are very secure. It shows up in the richness of their villas. The Roman Empire is structurally able to support itself. I mean, I do think this is an important point. It starts off as a conquest state, absolutely, but by the time we get to the 4th century, it is a structure that's been there at maximum extent for at least 400 years. This is not something that's relying massively on flows of wealth from the outside to keep it in business.
All right, so the periphery outside of Rome kind of rises,
Yes.
right? But Rome is doing just fine up until that point.
Yes.
I still can't imagine why does that tip it over into a decline or a fall? What exactly happens? Can you complete this image?
Yes. Of course, when we talk about Rome by the 4th century, we're not talking about the city of Rome and just central southern Italy. We are talking about
The empire.
the whole empire. This is the fundamental point one has to get. Who's a Roman in the 4th century? Well, it's everyone who participates in this elite landowning culture. So living in villas, learning Latin, learning the Latin, Greek classics, living under Roman law, participating in the political structures of empire. And they are everywhere. There are plenty of them in Britain, which is about the sort of furthest output, but also in Syria, all the way from Britain to northern Iraq, we have Romans who understood themselves as Roman and were accepted as Romans. So it's a big, big enterprise. Outside those frontiers, though, we have a whole series of actors whose political structures are becoming much more robust. They're capable of parrying. You see this in the 4th century. They're capable of parrying some Roman ambitions. They're not capable of conquering the empire. So confederations like the Goths that I cut my teeth on, for instance, in my doctoral thesis, can fend off the worst excesses of Roman imperialism in the 4th century, but they're not showing any signs of conquering large parts of it. Two things I think really change that. One is Rome's ambitions in the Near East have a kind of counter effect in the Persian world and generate a superpower competitor by the 3rd century for the first time. Rome hasn't had a superpower competitor for several centuries until the mid-3rd century, when we see the rise of a new Persian dynasty, the Sasanians. And from that point on, a very large chunk of Roman military and economic resources have to be devoted to the Persian frontier. In the 3rd century, Persians defeat and kill 3 Roman emperors and destroy their armies. By the end of the 3rd century, Rome has mobilized itself enough to restore stability to Persia, but the Persian threat hasn't gone away. So you've used up a lot of your spare economic surplus fending off Persia, and it will have to stay there. So when you look at the military listings and our other information, it suggests that something like a third of Rome's military establishment from 300 onwards is always pointing in a Persian direction. And you cannot move it. If you try and move it, then Persia will take advantage of it. So that's one big change. Then the other big change is the arrival of a steppe nomad group, the Huns, which causes chaos amongst these semi-subdued client states on Rome's European frontiers, people like the Goths that I studied. But all the way from the northern Black Sea littoral in about 370 to modern Hungary in about 410, so over a period of about 40 years, a Hunnic steppe empire builds up, partly by absorbing some of these client states like the Goths, but partly by, there are two reactions. Some get absorbed and the others run away into the Roman Empire. So involuntarily, in that generation from about 370 to 410, we see two massive waves of barbarian invasion of the Roman Empire, which is not a kind of, let's go and invade Rome because it's fun kind of phenomenon.
Adventurous
Yeah, it is.
expeditions.
There's no sign they would ever have done any of that if the Huns hadn't turned up. And an awful lot of those who try invading the Roman Empire get destroyed by Roman counteraction. This is not an easy thing to do. It's not a pleasant choice. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, but quite large numbers do, and enough that the Roman Empire can't defeat them all individually. So we get too big a rush. So what we then see is the build-up on Roman soil of these migrant groups into two larger confederations. Those that survive form themselves into two larger confederations that are big enough to survive on Roman soil. And they find out the hard way. Quite a lot of them die or are captured and turned into slaves or whatever, defeated, before the survivors form these two larger confederations. And this is the heart of what I studied in my doctoral work so many years ago now, is actually that process of taking these quite large client states from over the border and forming them into even bigger confederations on Roman soil, because they've run away from the Huns and in order to survive. And it's that which finally changes the balance of power against the Western Empire.
If I can go back to the painting from the beginning, I think, it successfully kind of conjures up a feeling of a very specific type of fear, which is, hey, my friend, look at the paradise we had, but we are letting it slip away. Usually, of course, because we are losing our core values,
Yes,
which is also why the image is popular online, especially with the conservatives. But as you're telling me, this is pretty much hogwash.
it is. As I said, the leaders of these two large confederations become part of
The
the
elite, or
part of
what?
the elite. Yeah, they all start learning Latin and reading Virgil. They become players in the Roman political game. What they do is that they start eroding parts of the Roman Empire's tax base, because the Vandal Islands settle in North Africa, which was the sort of jewel in the western half of the Roman Empire's crown. This is, we're talking here Tunisia, the snazzier parts of Morocco and Algeria. This is where, before, in the late 19th century and up to World War II, this is where all the rich people from Europe went on their holidays, and they all had villas. This is lovely. I don't know if you've been there, but this is a lovely place. Fabulous climate, very agricultural,
Yeah,
rich.
not really. I haven't been.
No,
No.
but it's where all the French designers and industrialists would have their summer homes and this kind
Right.
of stuff. This is a beautiful country. So the Vandal Islands set up there, one rich territory. The enlarged Gothic Confederation they set up in southwestern France, not a nice place. Every time the empire loses a chunk of its tax base, that immediately limits the size of the military forces that it can maintain, because the tax is what pays for the professional army. And what you see across the 5th century is the slow erosion of the buying power of the tax revenues coming into the center, um, in part because these confederations are able to expand the territories slowly that they control. But essentially what happens is that the Western Empire ceases to be able to exercise a predominance of military force within its own sphere of control as the tax revenues dry up. That's the process. There are two sacks of Rome, but the Roman Empire, the last of which is in 457, but the empire itself carries on after the sacks, and the city of Rome is still a pretty grand place. It's not the sacking that ends Rome, it's the disappearance of its military forces, because it can't. It no longer has the tax revenues to keep big enough military forces in being.
I have to say I'm only slightly but I am disappointed in a way because instead of this dramatic sack of Rome,
Yes.
this high drama, Rome collapses because it couldn't collect taxes anymore.
Yes.
I mean, this is not what I was expecting
No,
going into this
the central
conversation or
authority
at all.
runs out of buying power. Um,
I
and
mean,
and that means that local elites who are still there, like the British villa owners, have to navigate whatever way they can into a new future where the Roman state is no longer able to protect them.
but weren't Romans conscripting these Vandals and Goths into their armies at a certain
Yep,
point?
yep. They sometimes fight for them. Half the Roman army from the time of Augustus onwards consists of non-citizen auxiliaries, some of whom come from outside the frontier always.
But it wasn't enough.
No, and
Okay,
because you can't, if you mercenaries only fight for money, so
I see. I
if
see.
you run out of
Okay,
money,
here we go again.
yes,
Yes.
yes, indeed, follow the money.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've heard that before.
yes, I think someone said that in the past.
Yeah. Yes. um. Okay. Last pushback, and I already know what you're gonna say, but please humor me.
Yeah.
I read an article a while back. For the life of me, I can't remember who it was or where I read it. But I do remember that in it, the author insisted that one of the reasons, at least, why Rome fell was that the elites couldn't relate to the issues facing ordinary citizens anymore because they were so far removed from reality on the ground. That, of course, left them kind of unable to navigate this giant ship through the crises that it was facing. Is that a semi legitimate point or not at all again?
Well, there's an interesting observation lying underneath it, I think, which is that, of course, in the political debates and discourse of the Roman period, and indeed most pre-modern ones, what we call the ordinary people have no place or part. You don't have a vote.
That's brutal. Yeah.
I come from solid peasant stock. I know.
Right.
I know my great grand.
Same, to be
Yeah, no,
honest.
no. My great grandfather left the farm in about the 1860s. Prior to that point, he wouldn't have had a vote.
Right.
The stuff of politics is above your pay grade. You're not involved. No one gives a damn what you think. That is the brute reality. And when I'm teaching my students, though, I ask them to think, who are the politically enfranchised classes in any given era, who's participating in some ways in the political process. It's never, just three people. The groups involved can be considerably wider than that, and in some relatively underdeveloped economic context, you find quite large numbers of free peasant farmers who have a lot of legal rights and who are involved in low-level political discussions that feed into the high-level political discussions. So, it isn't just always one answer. You have to think about it. But the mass of the rural population is not involved in these political processes. The villa owners certainly are. Villa owners and above are profoundly involved in this process, and they are threatened by it in the sense that there's only a fixed stock of good agricultural assets. When a king of the Goths or a king of the Vandals settles his army in a place, they want agricultural assets. They don't want to go and dig holes. They don't want to be, getting out the spades and the picks and whatever, but they do want to be landowners. So there's a kind of competitive process about distribution of land. So villa owners care about this process and they're deeply involved in it. It's one of the myths that's knocking around in the historiography that the Roman landowners could say goodbye to the Roman state because its disappearance did not affect them. Indeed, they may have benefited from it by the fact that some of the tax demands disappeared. But that's not borne out by the evidence. Everywhere, the arrival of a new landowning group in terms of the chief supporters of barbarian kings distributing land to their followers, that had effects for Roman landowners, sometimes total. The landowning, Latinate, toga-wearing landowning class of southern Britain disappears completely. There is no sign of them. That we see a complete disappropriation of their landed properties. So that's total. Elsewhere, it's more of a deal, and actually the way in which Roman landowners are able to negotiate their way into the post-Roman world is by giving up part of their assets. And that's a more normal outcome. So across most of Gaul, though not, I think, in the northeast, where, again, the disappropriation was, I think, total. But in southern Gaul, the local landowners are able to do a deal with Gothic and Burgundian kings. Again, the Italians do deals with Gothic kings, and they're able to keep some of their assets. But they lose some. They do lose some of the capital assets on which their wealth is based. So they did care about it. It's more a question of, what the hell are you going to do when the state that has protected you for 400 years and which you have successfully navigated, its structures in order to build up your wealth, when that structure disappears? You are really caught in a difficult situation. So I think it's not that the landowning elites did not understand what was going on or were unaffected by what was going on. They knew perfectly well what was going on. And
Wow, fascinating. What does this immediate post Roman fall, in the West at least, world look like? I'm just imagining myself, what would I do if I was a Roman citizen and the institutions just disappeared? I'm just imagining myself sitting on a pile of rubble and just being like, what am I supposed to do now?
yes,
Where am I going? What am I doing? Like, or is it supplanted by a different system straight away, and the process is kind of seamless, and people don't even, ordinary people except the elites, don't even notice?
I think for a lot of peasant farmers, if you weren't in an area that got heavily fought over, you wouldn't notice very much. But
You were still a farmer working for somebody
yes,
else.
absolutely.
Okay.
But there were some places where fighting is fierce, and that has horrible consequences for everyone, as we know. And it was no less horrible in the early Middle Ages than it is now. It depended where you were. So in Britain, it looks as though Britain is taken over by a large number of quite small, intrusive groups crossing over the Channel. And there, I think, villas were reduced to piles of rubble and did disappear. It's a pretty violent and a pretty sudden process. In those areas where you've got a more organized taking over group, so where you're dealing with the king of a big Gothic confederation or a Vandal confederation, then that's what allows you then to start doing these deals. But you have to go to his court. I mean, I think the big change you would see would be you set out from your villa, but instead of going to the Roman regional capital, you go to the royal court of whoever your nearest powerful barbarian king is, and you say, well, if you keep me on, I can keep a certain amount of revenues flowing. And if you protect me so I only lose maybe a quarter of my assets, then I can give you a lot in return. I'm a very useful person. How about a deal? And that is, I think,
Wow.
what's happening across large parts of the former empire. It's that kind of a process.
How come the barbarian king is not, okay, we have a deal, and then a couple of months later he's like, hey mate, I'm gonna need 50% instead of 25%?
Well, exactly. I think that was the first shot. Things did move on, but what you see is a very interesting process unfolding over the next political generation, whereby the Roman landowners are able to keep some of their lands, but then we've got Europe now divided into a series of successor kingdoms which fight each other. And if they're fighting each other, what do we need? We need military manpower. We don't have large-scale taxation anymore. we changed from professional armies to armies composed of landowners and their retainers. And within a generation of the disappearance of the empire, if we say the empire disappears around about 470 with the overthrow of the last pretenders to the Western throne, by 500 we've got Roman landowners fighting for barbarian kings, turning up with their dependents. So the initial deal is we hold on to a bit of our assets. The longer term deal is we become military aristocrats. And actually that then brings about this extraordinary fusion between Goths and Romans in Spain, or Franks and Romans in Gaul, or whatever, because you're all doing the same kind of thing for the same royal courts.
So interesting how no matter what period of history we're talking about, the elites kind of find a way to survive, even though the whole Roman Empire has just collapsed.
Well, some of them do. I know.
Some of them. Okay, Britain is an exception.
Yeah.
You guys over there were a little bit too violent.
Britain, they were not on top of the process at all. And we don't know, of course. We can't give you a full body count, where, as it were,
right.
In any particular region, there used to be 90 villa owners, and 33 of them made it through.
Got bumped off. Right, right.
We tend to hear about those who are successful, because their descendants survive and write things, or So I wouldn't be sure that everybody makes it.
Okay, fair enough.
No.
Let's fast forward to the present time. As it stands right now, what are some of the most obvious parallels between the end of days of Rome and the West in 2024?
Well, to my mind, the big parallel is that the sort of Western world system, as it evolved after 1945, around with American leadership of a sort of coalition of very rich Western powers, that has transformed the non-Western world in the same way that the Roman Empire transformed the non-Roman world, and in such a way that it's building up, or it's changed the economic strategic context within which we all live within the planet. So, the Western world just about continues to develop economically and to grow slowly, very slowly. But what's really changing everything is the kind of growth rates that you see in the developing world. So that, not just BRIC countries, but other parts of the planet too. Over the last decade, 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are Africa. In a sense, China and India are yesterday's news. Africa is the future. The world is changing around us, and the figure that we start with in the book is that in 1999, the West is producing and consuming 80% of global GDP. 3/4 of everything is being consumed in the West. And that's an extraordinary level of economic domination. That's down to about 60%, and most of that happening in the crash of 2008, but then slowly moving down subsequently. But we've gone from 80 to 60%, but that's not because the total size of the world economy has shrunk, or even that Western economies have shrunk by on that scale. It's because the economies of the rest of the planet have grown so much and are continuing to grow. So that's the fundamental message. It's a bit like the one about the Roman Empire. The empires do not have their fates totally in their hands. You can't necessarily expect them to go on forever. There may not be something that allows you to continue the same level of global domination that you've exercised over a previous era, because the context in which you're now operating has changed so much. And that's the fundamental narrative that drew John and myself together. I thought I saw it in the Roman world. I thought I saw it already in the modern world, looking at it as a pretty well informed but not expert on the modern world. It seemed to me those patterns were very clear, but he's an expert in the developing world, in modern political. He's a political economist with a specialism in the developing world. So he was interested in the non-Western world and has lived and worked there all his life. But we got into a conversation, and we both felt that this is the big story, and Western politicians go around talking as though it's entirely in their hands, and elect me and I can reverse this and whatever, and everything will be fantastic if you elect me. We can make America great again. You can't make America great like it was in the 1950s, because the level of economic power that it had in the 1950s can never be replicated. It belonged to a particular moment. Most of the rest had been flattened. Rest of the West had been flattened by World War II, and the developing world hadn't developed yet. So America is globally dominant in an extraordinary way in the 1950s and on into the 1960s. But it belongs to that time. And you won't begin to make sensible choices about how to proceed from where we are now unless you really see that, unless you stop pretending that something that belonged to a particular moment could magically be recreated in a totally changed global context.
So in this case, if we acknowledge this pill that it's quite hard to swallow, what is the best course of action in the West? Since the fate is not entirely in our hands anymore, what can we do to kind of ease the pain?
There are various things that you can do to maximize your position going forward, and that probably need to be done. I mean, one is, obviously, it would change the nature of the relations that you develop with the world around you. And John and I both think, for instance, that there are an awful lot of countries that have emerged to statehood out of colonial pasts, and who share considerable values with Western countries. And in saying what we're saying, we both think that there is certain structures that develop within the Western world that make life better for most people. And we think particularly of relatively free presses, particularly of rule of law. I teach a lot of students now who come from different autocratic societies of one kind or another, Eastern Bloc, Chinese, whatever. And they do say when they come to Britain, they can't believe how relaxed everyone is. And the reason that people
relaxed in what way? In daily life?
Yes, in daily life. And it's simply,
right.
You can't just be screwed over in Britain or any other Western country because the person next door to you has got connections into the party. Whereas you can, everything is so much more fragile in autocratic societies, because if you've got a chain of connection that allows you can just pull the rug out from someone. The rule of law is far from perfect.
I'm from Eastern Europe, so I think it's a bit of a different story. Although I don't want to make it seem too bad, because I'm from Slovenia.
Sure.
But still, I think, maybe it's also because it's a small country, so people know each other, and these circles of power are kind of incestuous, and everybody knows each other, and there's a lot of corruption and nepotism.
It takes a long time, actually, this is a kind of problem in the 1990s, where people were swanning around patronizing, people from the West were patronizing the rest of the world and saying, why don't you just be like us? Whatever. It was 200 years of fighting within Western societies after the Industrial Revolution that actually created a rule of law which protects most people reasonably well. Rich people still have an advantage, but it's not an overwhelming advantage. That's where you're trying to get to. You'll never invent a system where it isn't worthwhile being rich, but you want it so that the advantage of being rich is limited, that you can't just do what the hell you want. That's
Well, I wonder if even in the West we are kind of leaving this point. These ultra billionaires are now owning digital platforms that we're all using, sort of like public spaces. I heard this uh, ex Greek finance minister saying that we've left the realm of capitalism and are now living in techno feudalism.
uh,
I think he wrote a book about it.
yeah, no, sure.
So,
Uh, I certainly think the challenges are there. The challenges are
yeah,
deeply there, and again, recognizing them is very important. You'll not get anywhere towards limiting them if you don't realize that that is a problem. That's why inequality, huge inequality, is such a problem, because
right.
it gives so much advantage to the very wealthy, uh, not least by having a very vulnerable larger group of people who will having to do anything to survive, so they will respond to what rich people want. No, I mean, I think thinking a bit harder about what democracy means. So you were asking me about parallels. So the first parallel is very much the development of the developing world and changing that strategic context. But it does have the knock-on effect then of creating challenges and problems within Western society, because expectations about continued growth of wealth within the West are unrealistic. And therefore, that then creates tensions and stresses, because people expect, to carry on becoming richer. My children's generation is the first one that probably won't be richer than their parents.
Yep.
So how are we going to respond to that? Are we going to accept that in a kind of sensible way, or is that going to lead people to vote for people who seem to offer easy answers? They're actually rubbish, but uh, that offer a kind of false hope that somehow the fundamental change in the global patterns of economic organization can somehow be overturned by voting for this particular person in Britain. Well, really,
Yeah.
you
Yeah. Yeah.
you can see that the challenges are
Right.
seriously there. Challenges are very seriously there.
Professor, is it always necessary that when the periphery rises, that an empire must fall and the periphery sort of takes over? I'm thinking about the so-called polycentric world order people keep talking about lately all the time. So we have the West, which is not as strong as it used to be. We also have China. We have India, as you mentioned. We have Africa, African states, and they're all kind of sort of equally strong, maybe keeping an eye on each other. It's maybe an uneasy equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium nevertheless. Is that possible?
I think that is possible, and I alternate between being optimistic and pessimistic. As I think any sensible person would.
As I was saying it, I realized it's too optimistic. You're right.
No, well, I'm not sure it is necessarily, in the sense that if we can get past our colonial heritages in the West and accept the fact that everybody else has a right to be wealthy too, and we have no particular right to be massively more wealthy than everybody else, and in fact, a lot of our extra edge in terms of wealth came from some very dodgy lines of economic development, which had a lot to do with slavery, and that story has still got a lot of mileage to run yet. If we can get past that, then it is possible to build coalitions and alliances, and there won't just be one of them. But we do actually need that to happen, because there are some big things that are much bigger than rise and fall of the West or whatever to be dealt with.
Right.
You know, global warming,
Yeah.
pollution.
Yeah, exactly.
We all have
This
to work
leads me to
together.
my
There's no point in having a kind
right.
of
Well,
individual.
this is actually right, right.
Yeah,
This is my last
sure.
question, Professor, because for the first time, like you mentioned, we are facing truly collective challenges as humanity: the climate breakdown, AI,
Yeah.
probably a couple of more epidemics, and also to a degree the population collapse. At least in the West, also China is dealing with that. Sure, there used to be localized natural disasters or catastrophes before, but most of these issues we can't solve as individual countries anymore, right? If we don't work together, we all go down.
Yes.
Do you think it's possible for empires of today, kind of always hungry for power, as we see in the news, to not see this as just another power grab? In other words, despite our tribalism, can we smarten up enough to cooperate and survive?
I think we can. I mean, I wouldn't put my house on betting that we will, but I think we can.
Okay.
If you think in evolutionary terms and you look at human beings, we are we have an extraordinary capacity for cooperation. It is the capacity for cooperation that has made us the dominant predator across the planet. We don't have very big teeth. We don't have massive claws. We're quite fast. We're not very fast. It is the capacity for cooperation that has made human beings such a dominant force. As far as we can tell, if you look at the history of planetary evolution, there has never been a species that's been this dominant. So that is both the problem, but is also potentially the route to success. If we have the capacity to revise our concepts of them and us, so that all of humanity is us, that we do all need to work together, we do all have a stake together in ensuring that the conditions on the planet remain viable for our descendants, then it can be done. I mean, over time, human societies have increased in scale and size. They've revised their boundaries of them and us from quite small and limited ones to bigger ones. Sounds like a big order. It sounds like a difficult problem, but I'm not without hope, because I think, at the moment you can still go around more or less saying climate change is a fraud and all this kind of stuff. You can just about get away with it. In another 10 years, you won't be able to. And the demographic effects of massively aging populations in the West that require a lot of thought and structural solutions, and that are not unrelated to what you might do about the areas of the planet that are going to become less and less habitable. Those kind of things will move beyond. I think we will move beyond the very divisive political debates of the moment, because I think it'll just become clear that they're no use, and that it's leading people down blind alleys. It won't be
As we
pretty and it
say,
won't be easy, but I
right.
think it can be done.
Okay. As we say back home, from your mouth to God's ears, because things are looking pretty scary out there.
Oh,
I'm
they
not
are.
gonna
Yeah,
lie.
no, I'm not unscared. I don't want. I wouldn't want to come off thinking that I'm, some
Right.
born again internationalist looking at the world through rose tinted spectacles. I have no illusions about, how ruthless human beings are. That's, you've got to understand us as the most vicious, intelligent predator that evolution has ever thrown up. Otherwise, the history of the world since human beings appeared with it on the earth, it makes no sense. So you really do have to take that time depth view, but we do also have this extraordinary capacity for cooperation. So
A sobering thought. Professor, if you can humor me one last time, who was the absolutely the worst Roman emperor, and why?
so,
Please humor me. Let's end on this note.
that's such a great question.
Thank you.
Who do I think is the worst? Um,
Like, absolutely just a complete mess from start to finish.
yes, that's. I think.
Whoever comes to mind.
I think. Sadly, although I quite like him, in some ways,
Interesting start.
the Emperor Julian of the 4th century, who
Okay.
is.
Is that the guy who was killed by the Persians?
Yes,
No,
yes, it is.
it
He
was.
was killed by the
Okay.
Persians, but
Wow.
he's the guy who tries to turn the Christian empire back into the pagan empire, and he tries to uh, turn the whole of the non-Christian world into a kind of mirror image pagan church, which had never been. You know, all the non-Christian cults were separate cults, and they all did different things and whatever. And he tries to make everyone
that
think.
sounds pretty good.
Yeah, no, I mean it was, but he's the idiot who goes into battle at the end, having forgotten to put his armor on.
Okay, well, okay, yeah,
thus
okay, I can
bringing his
understand why you chose
thus bringing
this
his
dude. Yeah,
short-lived attempt to repaganize the empire to a shuddering halt as he gets a spear through the chest. You know,
Darwinism at work.
yes, and you
Okay.
know, if you read his works, he really is a bit of an idiot. You know, poor fella. You might say he's a bit unlucky in that so much of his writing survived, so you can read about him a lot. But
I think I will do just that
yeah,
before bed tonight
he kind of
to
took
cheer
a kind
myself
of
up.
first year undergraduate approach to historical analysis, you might say, and sufficient power to act on it. And it's the combination of the two that makes him, in the end, so utterly.
Reminds me of myself, to be honest. Thank you so much, Professor Heather. What an amazing conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Where can people get your book?
What?
Find bookstores
Yeah,
everywhere.
find bookstores everywhere. We're being translated too. There are two Chinese versions, one mainland China and one Taiwan. That would make fascinating comparison if one was able to
Interesting.
read both.
Right.
But Spanish, Italian, don't think there's French yet. There is a German translation coming, but English versions, of course, fully available. There'll be an English paperback very shortly.
Right.
That's in the works, but it's a nice.
Okay.
As you've seen, it's not a very long read. It's
Yeah. We'll put the link in the
it's meant
description
to be
on
lively
YouTube.
and fun. Well, is it fun? I don't know.
Absolutely.
Stimulating, but
Stimulate.
yeah.
Yeah, a good word. Professor, do you have any social media where people can find what you're up to these days?
No, I'm a sad old English git who doesn't do social media, so I don't do it.
Too busy living life as it should be.
Well, my children laugh at me, of course, but I've always made it a principle to stay at least one major technological shift behind the rest of the world so that I can get on with doing what I want to do rather than having to run around after it. So far it seems to have worked out all right, but
To be honest, I envy you. Professor, thanks again.
my
I
pleasure.
hope we can do this again in the future.
I would love to.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing and following Smart Cookies on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to go on and become my benefactor on Patreon. So I'll be able to keep having these awesome conversations with really, really smart folks. Which brings me to my existing patrons, in effect producers of this podcast, a set of absolute legends without whom Smart Cookies would not exist in the first place. My immense gratitude goes to Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordan, Lorenzo, Mila, Veronica, Teja, Jurechuk, Goran, and Carmen. Your support means everything, so thank you.